Welcome back, it's Riot from Night Riot Cosplays. Today I have part 2 of 4, because it's 4 now. I have part 2 of 4 of the making of my Blossoming Starlight Klee cosplay. Originally this was going to be a 3-part series, but this video, if I had put the entire outfit making of into this video, I would have made this video like an hour plus long. So instead I chopped this into 2 parts that are each about half an hour long. So all 4 of the videos are going to end up being about half an hour long. I'm sorry, but if I want to show you guys exactly what I did so that you guys can follow it and make your own Blossoming Starlight Klee cosplay, then it's a necessary evil. That being said, in this video I'm covering the entire first layer of Klee's outfit, which is her shirt, her trousers, or bloomers, however you want to call it, and a little black neck thing that she has on her. That's what's included in this video. In the next video I'll be covering the rest of her outfit, and then video 4 will be mostly the making of the 3D printed parts and the bag as well. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoy the video, and I hope you guys learn from it, because that's what I'm trying to do here. I'm just trying to show you guys my process so that you can make your own Blossoming Starlight Klee cosplay. So let's get crafting. So to start this project, we need to start with a pattern. I decided that instead of trying to find a commercial pattern here to copy and just make, it would have been so much easier, honestly. But I decided I was going to drape this pattern myself. This is my first time ever draping a pattern, so it takes a lot of trial and error, and I do not recommend that your first draping project be pleats, but here I am anyway doing it. That being said, you want to start by overlapping your fabric so it overlaps a bunch of the seam lines. Like, you need a lot of extra fabric when you are draping. And then you can start folding your fabric over and making your pleats. For me, I did about a 1.5 inch pleat, and then a 1 inch pleat, and then a 1/2 inch pleat to give kind of a size variation. Looking back at this now, these probably should have been pin tucks instead of pleats, but at the time when I looked at the reference photo, it looked like pleats to me, so I said, let's do pleats. And if you don't know the difference between a pleat and a pin tuck, like I didn't know the difference when I started this project, let me know and I can make a tutorial on a bunch of basic cosplay sewing things. But for reference, if you are doing this, I would definitely do pin tucks here instead of pleats. But with the pleats draped and in a way that I was happy with, I could go in and start cutting out where my seam lines are. Typically, you want to cut where your shoulder seam is going to be, where your armhole sleeve is going to go, like that opening on the armhole, and then you want to cut the bottom to length so that it's where you want it to stop, where you're going to hem it. And then I also made a center seam here as well. Typically you don't want to add a center seam to a project like this, but you'll see how we cover it up later. And then you also want to make the seam for your neckline. Then I just go through and I mark with pen, because this is just draping fabric, so it doesn't really matter. I go in with pen and I mark where my pleats are, specifically where my lines meet up, so that when I take this apart and I transfer it to pattern paper or to my actual fabric, I can see exactly where I need my pleats to line up. Then with the front being the hardest part out of the way, I drape some more fabric onto my dress form and I start making the back panel. This was a really simple back panel to do. You simply just pin your fabric onto the back of your dress form and you start cutting where you want your seam lines to be. For me on here, it was straight up the back, and then there's actually a little like loop or like a cutout part in the back of the neck on this, which is how you open and close the neckline so that it's not hard to get like your head into, which I cut out here as well. And then I cut my side seam to match up with the front panel, and then I cut out my armhole as well. Then I take the front and back panels off of my dress form and I drape a little bit more fabric onto my dress form to make that black collar bolero type thing that Klee has, which is really simple. It really is just a big triangle. So I just cut out where my neckline needed to go, the shoulder sleeve seam, and then where and then we have to make our sleeves yet. So I take one of my panels and I trace out the shape of the armhole onto some scrap fabrics I had taped together. And then once I have the armhole drawn out onto my paper, I find the center of that like armhole part that we traced, and I fold it in half so that we get a half a pattern so that both sides are symmetrical. And then I draw a line straight down. You can kind of see how we're starting to make the shape here of a sleeve pattern. Then I measure on my arm how long I want the sleeve to be, making sure that I'm accounting for the ruffle that she has on the bottom. And I start adding my seam allowances as well, all around. I usually go with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, but you can go with whatever you're most comfortable with. I just make sure to mark it out and draw my lines. And then I cut the sleeve pattern out of this scrap fabric, or scrap paper. Then I take that pattern and I fold it in half once and then again, and I cut along those lines, because this is how we're going to make sure we get that puffy sleeve that Klee has. So with those 4 pieces cut out, I lay it on some taped together scrap paper again, making sure that the top edge where the armhole is, I'm leaving connected perfectly so that it doesn't change the size of that. But I spread out the papers on the bottom to make gaps in between so that we have more fabric there to make sure we get a nice puffy sleeve. What you should get when you're done is a sleeve pattern that has about twice as much fabric on the bottom part of the sleeve, but is the same size and shape of the armholes. And then when I'm done with that, I just fold it in half and only cut out half of the pattern to make sure that when I cut it out of my fabric, I have a symmetrical sleeve pattern. Then with all of our patterning and draping done, I take my front panel and I start by laying it on my fabric and cutting it out of my nice fabric. I just used a white cotton here, making sure that I'm adding a 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way around. And then once I have the base cut out, I go in with some tailor's chalk and I mark where my lines are for my pleats. I also make sure that I'm marking those pleat lines on both pieces of fabric, because you need 2 to make the front panel. So make sure you're cutting out 2 pieces of fabric and that you're transferring your markings to both. Then I do the same with my back panel, which is significantly easier, just making sure that I'm adding my 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way around. And then Klee has this type of like really cute button placket on the front of her shirt. So I decided that instead of making this out of a white cotton, I was going to take a white cotton with a little design on it. So all I'm doing is I'm taking that fabric and I'm cutting out a rectangle. So I want the button placket, when it's done being sewn, to be about 1 inch wide. So I cut out a rectangle of this nice fabric about 2 inches wide, because we have to account for seam allowance, and I do 1/2 inch seam allowance on both sides. So it's 2 inches wide by however long my front panels are. Then I take out my iron and I start ironing all of my pattern pieces nice and flat to make everything easier to sew together. And when I get to the button placket part, I am folding my seam allowances, the 1/2 inch seam allowance under, like you would when you're making bias binding, except we're not going to fold it in half. We just need the seam allowance underneath. And then here I also take the time to make sure that my pleats are nicely lining up how they were on the dress form, and I press them into place. Once you've ironed down all of your pleats, I definitely recommend sewing down your pleats at this point. I did not sew down my pleats when I was at this point, and it caused me such a problem later on. So make sure that once you have your pleats, pinned down and ironed down, take it to your sewing machine, run a running stitch down the edge of it, like a straight stitch down the edge of that pleat. You will thank me later. With the front pleated, I was able to move on to the back of the shirt. It was at this point that I realized that if I tried to roll hem, that kind of opening in the back of the shirt, it was not going to be easy, and it was not going to look as nice as I wanted it to, especially because I was trying to make this costume competition quality. So what I ended up doing was making something like a facing. All I did is I took my original pattern and I traced out the edge of where that kind of curved part is, and then the rest of it I just kind of made a square. And I took those square edges and I hemmed them, I roll hemmed them, and then I pinned the facing to the back panel right sides together, and then I sewed along that kind of curvy edge. Then I went in and I clipped my seams. When you're doing some seams like this, you have to make sure that on the ones that are kind of, rounded out and convex, you are cutting little triangles into them, and then the ones that are kind of curved inwards or concave, that you're just cutting little snips into them. This just makes it so that when you turn it around, like turn it inside out, you can, the seam isn't pulling on itself and looking all bunched up and ugly. You're like giving it some room to wiggle and move around. Then when I was done clipping all the curves, I turned it inside out, and I had a perfectly finished edge for that curvy part, and I did not have to add a lining to this garment. That was like the important part for me. I did not want to add a lining to this because I wanted to keep it as light and airy as I could. Then with the facing done and all the pleats done, I was able to start sewing the shirt normally. All I did was sew up my back seam, and then I finished that edge with a turned under hem. To do a turned under hem, you just press open the seam that you have just sewn, and then you turn the seam allowance under itself, and then you sew a straight stitch along both sides on that. For the front seam, however, I actually sewed it wrong sides facing each other. So that the seam would be on like the pretty side of the fabric, and then I pressed open that seam, and this is going to get covered by our like button placket piece. So I pressed my seam, and then I made sure to trim them down a little bit with my pinking shears. And then I took my button placket that we had ironed and folded under before, and I pinned it on top, and then I ran 2 straight seams down the sides to perfectly cover this raw edge and add a beautiful button facing to the front. And with the button facing sewn on, I just went in and sewed on these cute little bunny buttons I found at Joann's. Then I moved on and sewed up my shoulder seams just like you would any other shirt, and I made sure to finish those edges, but I did not do the side seams yet because we need to insert our sleeves yet, but we still have to make them. So let's go make those. Let me tell you right now, this sleeve pattern was the absolute hardest thing ever to do. Like, these sleeves took forever and a lot of trial and error. The footage that you're gonna see in the background of the upcoming clips isn't even the correct footage because I was doing everything wrong when I recorded this. And I got so frustrated with it that I completely forgot to turn on the camera to record how I actually did it. So instead, I have a series of very shitty drawings to explain what I did to make these sleeves. I said before that I was using 2 different types of fabric for this top, or the top part of Klee's costume. One was a patterned cotton and one was a plain white cotton. So to start, you take the plain white cotton and you cut out 2 pieces of your sleeve pattern that we made previously, and you mark kind of on that pattern. We had marked how big we wanted our ruffle, so you need to mark that on this sleeve pattern as well. Then on a piece of paper, I draw out the shape of the bottom of Klee's ruffle. It isn't a perfect like ruffle shape, but it also isn't like a scallop shape or anything, so I had to freehand draw this onto paper, this kind of squiggly thing that she has on it. And then I cut it out of the paper and I transfer that pattern with a water-soluble pen, or like a fabric-safe pen, onto my fabric. Make sure that you're using something that can either be removed with water or with like ironing it. I did a disappearing pen. I used a disappearing pen on this one, and the marks never completely went away, and I think it's because it's a purple pen on white fabric, so just keep that in mind. Once you're done tracing the pattern onto the fabric, you have to cut it out. I highly suggest pinning both of your sleeve pieces together and then tracing out this pattern on only the top piece of fabric, but you cut the pattern out of both pieces of fabric at the same time, making sure you go slowly and that you're going around those curves nicely. Then once you're done cutting out the pattern, you take some Fray Check, or I think a white glue could work for this as well, just anything that you can use to finish a raw edge. You're going to spread it all around that edge that you just cut out, all around that squiggle that we had drawn on it. It is a very tedious process to get this curvy part onto the sleeve, but it is worth it in the end, and this was the easiest way I could find that I could do this. You could also cut this out with like a Cricut machine if you had it. I just decided to cut it out by hand. Cutting out that ruffle is the hardest part of this entire sleeve, honestly. Once you're done with that, we can move on. You need a piece of fabric now. It's a rectangle that's about the same width as the bottom of your sleeve and about 5 inches wide. This piece of fabric I ended up cutting out of my patterned cotton, the one with the little pattern on it.
because I thought it would give it a little bit more visual appeal if I did it out of a different fabric. No one really sees it in the end, but I know it's there, so that's the important part. Anyway, with that piece of fabric, you want to hem the top and the bottom edge by roll hemming it and just making sure you add a straight stitch there. And then lastly, you want to layer. You put the little rectangle of fabric underneath, and then you put the ruffled piece of like the sleeve pattern on top of that. And then I measured about 1/4 of an inch from here to here, and then I sewed the first line of stitches about 1/4 of an inch away from there, and then I did a second line of stitches about 1/4 inch away from the first, which would be from here to here. This is going to give us the channel that we need to string our elastic to get that poofy sleeve on the top and the ruffle edged on the bottom. Then with those 2 lines of stitching done, you're going to take your elastic. I used a cording elastic like you would use for friendship bracelets, but you can use any elastic that fits into that channel. I measured around my arm, making sure that it was a little bit tight but not uncomfortably tight, and added a little bit of seam allowance to the ends. And then I threaded it through the channel, and I ran a couple straight stitches across the edges to make sure that it stayed in place. We can sew the sleeves to the armholes on our top that is like half assembled. I personally go with the sew the curve and then the side seams method, but you can sew the sleeves on however you like. Let me know if you guys want a tutorial on how to do that. But I sew on the sleeves, and then I sew up the side seam, and then I roll hem the bottom edge and the neckline, and that completes Klee's top. Moving on from the shirt, I finally can move on to the pants. Instead of self-patterning this one, I used an existing pattern. I used pattern from Simplicity number 8389. I really am not that experienced in making pants when it comes to cosplay, so I don't have a very good video showing how I made this. But for the most part, I used the pattern. I followed the instructions that came in the envelope. I only made a few adjustments. I made the waistband. I made it to make a casing for an elastic waistband. And then I also added some length to the sides of the pattern so that I would have enough fabric to give it the poof of the bloomers that Klee has. And then the bottom edge, I just cut it up. I measured on myself how long I wanted the shorts to be, and then that's how long I put on the pattern. I just cut off the extra, and then I did the same technique that I used on the sleeves for the ruffled bottom on the shorts. Moving on from all the white fabric, I can finally pull out my black cotton to make that kind of shoulder collar thing that Klee has. So all I do here is I take the pattern that I had draped onto my dress form earlier, and I cut out 4 pieces from this black cotton. I then also measure how long the outside edge is of the triangle, and I take that times 2, and I cut a rectangle of fabric. The width of the rectangle is double the length of the edge of the triangle, and then I wanted my ruffles to be about 3/4 of an inch wide, so I took 3/4 times 2 because we fold it over, and then I added an inch for seam allowance. I cut 2 rectangles for the sides of the triangles for that ruffle, and then I measure around my neck and I take that times 2 as well, and I cut another rectangle the same height as the other 2, but the width is my neck times 2, my neck measurement times 2, to make the ruffle around the neck as well. With all that cut out, I take my long rectangles that are going to be used as ruffles, I take them to my iron, and then I press them flat to make sure that there's no creases, and then I fold them in half and I press it as well. This just makes it easier for when we sew it onto our triangles later. Then I take those ruffles, or those long strips, rectangles of fabric, and I take them to my sewing machine. In my sewing machine, I make sure that I'm using at least one colored thread that is a different color than the fabric I'm using. This is not to be lazy, this is just so that later we can see it, but you're going to set your stitch length so that it is the longest and widest stitches that you can get, and then you're going to run 2 lines of stitching down the top raw edge of those rectangles of fabric, about 1/4 of an inch apart from each other. While I was at the sewing machine, I also forgot to mention that we want to sew up the shoulder seams on that ruffle piece, because it's like a triangle that flops over our shoulder. So I pin the right sides together and I sew along the shoulder seam of the triangles, so that you have 2 pieces sewn together of like really long, almost 2 mountain shapes. Then you're carefully going to separate the threads. When you're done, you should have 4 threads on each end of your rectangles of fabric. So I take something sharp, I'm just using my snips here, but you can use anything. Don't cut the threads, but you want to separate them so that you can see the 4 separate threads. Here, you want to separate them so that you have the top thread and then the bobbin thread. I separate them and I take the 2 of the threads from the same side. So if I would have stitched this the right way, I would have picked the 2 bobbin threads. That's what I usually pick. You take both bobbin threads, which is the pink color here, and then you gently tug on them and you shuffle the fabric down the stitch lines to get that ruffled effect. Here, as my ruffles start to get even more and more gathered together, I start measuring it against the side of my triangle pieces, and you're basically trying to gather that long rectangle down to the width that your triangles were originally. Once they're the right size, I start pinning them down, making sure that as I put a pin in, I am pulling on the fabric a little bit more as well to make sure that it is the correct size at the end. And then usually when you're pinning ruffles down, you want to use a lot of pins, but here I'm purposefully leaving about an inch between each piece that I'm pinning, because then what we do is we sandwich the ruffle between the 2 pieces of fabric, and you have to pin that top fabric. So in those spaces, I put another pin to make sure that it's pinned down nicely, so that when we sew, absolutely nothing will move. Here you can see how I said we are going to sandwich the ruffle between the 2 pieces. Then once you have the ruffle pinned in place and sandwiched between 2 pieces of fabric, you can take it to the sewing machine and sew all around, making sure that the only piece that you're leaving open is where the neckline is. When you're done sewing everything, you should have 2 pieces that look like this weird double mountain thing going on. What you want to do here now is clip the corners. You want to basically cut off the little triangles on the end so that when you turn it inside out, you can get a perfect corner. And then I also trim all of my seam allowances down with my pinking shears. Then you can turn the pieces inside out by the neck hole, and making sure that in those corners you're using something blunt but pointy at the same time to poke out those corners nicely so that the ruffle is nicely showing. Then I apparently lost some footage here, but once those ruffles are sewn in, you want to take the edges, like the neckline, and you want to turn them under 1/4 of an inch, like inside, so that you have a somewhat finished end. And you want to pin it, but don't sew it yet, because what we're going to do is we're going to connect the 2 pieces by the neckline with the ruffle that we have to do in the neckline. So that last ruffle that we have, that long piece of fabric that we gathered with the neck measurement, you're going to gather it up and then you're going to stuff it in between the turned under edges of the neckline, pinning it nicely, and then sewing as close to the edge as you can get. When that's done, your kind of bolero shoulder thing should be about done. You have to go in, and if there's any visible thread from the ruffles on the outside, you need to unpick them all. Like, I had used a pink thread on mine, and in some places you could see it, so I had to unpick all the pink thread in my ruffle. And then in order to get those square looking ruffles, you just press it down, making sure that you're not running, like ironing across them. You are actually just pressing down, pick it up, move it over, pressing down to get those nice squares. And then mine, I shorted on purpose, so it was a little bit shorter than the actual circumference of my neck. All I did was I sewed a snap to one end, and then I connected the two sides with a little bit of black elastic. And with that, the first layer of Blossoming Starlight Klee's outfit is done.
And that's how I made the entire first layer of Blossoming Starlight Klee's outfit. Again, next week I'll be putting out the other half of the video, which is covering the rest of her outfit, so please be on the lookout for that. Please make sure that you are checking the description box. Down there I have the list of all the materials that I used, as well as links to my Patreon, which has sources on them and files that you guys can use to make your own Blossoming Starlight Klee cosplay. It costs absolutely nothing to join my Patreon. All of these resources I am giving out for free, so please take advantage of them for your own costumes. Leave any questions you guys might have about my process in the comments, and I'll try my best to answer them, both in the comments and future videos. And yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this half of the tutorial, and I hope to see you again next week for the other half. Bye!